So, hello, everyone. I can't see you, but I assume you can see me. My name is Henry Hart. I'll be talking about my new book about Seamus Heaney, but I'd like to wait just a few minutes for everyone to join the talk. So I'll begin in about 3 minutes or so. Okay, well, I hope everyone has been able to join the talk today. I'm going to be talking about my new book called Seamus Heaney's Gifts. I have a copy right here. I don't know if you can see, I'm wearing green. The book is green, and I'll be talking about the famous Irish writer, Seamus Heaney. But first, I'd like to give you a brief introduction. Usually, when I introduce myself, I say that I'm a poet who writes poetry. I write about poetry. I've written a number of books about poets. And usually when I introduce myself like that, I get two responses. The first response is a little bit discouraging. People will say, so you write and teach poetry. Well, I thought poetry was dead. I've heard that many times, and I have my reply, but it tends to be a conversation stopper. The second way people respond to my introductions is friendlier. They'll say, "Oh, uh, who is your favorite poet?" And I usually respond by saying, "Well, I have a number of favorite poets, but one of my most favorite poets is Seamus Heaney." And if they ask me, "Why is Seamus Heaney a favorite poet of yours?" I say there are two main reasons. One, I've always been attracted to the subject matter of his poetry. And two, I've always been attracted to the music of his poetry, his poetic voice, his style. As many of you probably know, with regard to the subject matter of his poems, he often wrote about growing up on what he called a hard scrabble farm in Northern Ireland. He grew up doing what farmers normally do. He was taking care of his father's cows. He was helping with the mowing. He was digging up potatoes, um, doing other farming chores. And I think a lot of his most resonant poems are memory poems. He's remembering some of the things that he did on the farm. And I'll talk a little bit more about the significance of his first farm, which was called Mossbawn. So when I first started reading Seamus Heaney's poems back in the 1970s, I felt an immediate connection with them. I think because I had also grown up on a similar farm, well, different in some ways. It was a small Christmas tree farm in New England, but I had worked on some of the dairy farms near our house. Uh, I worked for an old Italian farmer at the end of the road in his barn, taking care of his cows, dealing with hay bales. I worked for another farmer picking potatoes. Um, and well, one of Seamus Heaney's first poems was called Digging. I spent a lot of time digging holes in the ground to plant Christmas tree seedlings. I planted hundreds and hundreds of Christmas tree seedlings. And then I would mow around the trees to keep the hay down, the brush, the vines down. I'd prune the trees, and then we'd sell the trees right around this time. In fact, I was back on part of the old Christmas tree farm just about a week ago, giving away some of our remaining Christmas trees to friends. Somebody once pointed out that uh, Taylor Swift and I share an experience of growing up on a Christmas tree farm. But I think Taylor Swift only spent a few years on the Christmas tree farm. And I think my farming experience was much more down to earth, much more like Heaney's. But it wasn't only the subject matter of Heaney's poems that appealed to me. As I say, it was also the music of his poetry. And I think what I responded to was the way he mixed the alliterative verse, the alliterative style of poems like Beowulf, a poem that later on in his career he translated. The way he mixed that alliterative style with the metrical style, especially the iambic style of later English poetry. I also responded to the narrative aspect of Heaney's poems. It seemed to me that he was often telling a story, telling an old story, but in a new way, in his own unique way. What was that story? I would say it was the story that appears in religious literature, mythical literature, the story of the fall from a paradise of innocence, the fall from a kind of Garden of Eden into a painful knowledge of the world's conflicts, the world's realities. I think his fall, and I think he would agree with this, his fall began when he was about 12 years old in 1951, when he had to leave his family farm, which he often compared to a Garden of Eden. He had to leave the farm to be a boarding student at a Catholic high school, a private Catholic high school on the northern coast of Northern Ireland. It was very, very traumatic for him. In some of his interviews and articles, he talks about how he was so homesick, he was so depressed, he could barely eat for weeks. He got used to his new environment. In the end, he did quite well. But it was definitely a kind of fall for him. And I think that fall was compounded shortly afterwards when a brother of his, a younger brother of his, was killed in a road accident very close to the family farm. mossbawn. That experience was so traumatic for the family that Seamus Heaney's parents decided to sell the farm and move. And I think after that happened, Heaney always thought back to that original farm as a kind of Eden he had lost, and Eden he had fallen away from. So I think that story, I guess you could call it a mythical story, resonated for me because I felt that I had gone through something similar, although my fall into knowledge was a little bit different. I should also say, I think when Heaney was a teenager, he he gradually became more and more aware of the painful history of conflicts in Ireland, and especially Northern Ireland, his native country. The conflict between Protestants and Catholics, the conflict between the British and the Irish. And it seems to me that also became a central subject of a lot of his poetry. So I say for me, my fall into knowledge was a kind of fall away from this Edenic Christmas tree farm in New England, was really a fall into the knowledge of nuclear warfare and the Vietnam War. And whether he intended this or not, I would have to say my father was instrumental in initiating me into a knowledge of nuclear warfare and the Vietnam War. I have vivid memories of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, when there was a fear that Russian missiles in Cuba would be launched and strike the US, my father talked a lot about his experience of nuclear warfare. So during World War II, he was in charge of a platoon that was given orders to go to the outskirts of Hiroshima shortly after the bomb was dropped. And even though it was against the rules, my father got a camera and with a couple of his army friends, they walked through the ruined city of Hiroshima. And my father took a lot of pictures. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he told me and other members of my family he wanted to show us the kind of devastation that a nuclear attack could cause. So, and again, I have vivid memories of going into the living room, my father putting up a sheet on the wall and showing us slides of Hiroshima. Well, I was 8 years old at the time. I was rather innocent. And this was an eye-opening experience for me. And then later in the 60s, my father, who was always talking about his experiences in World War II and the Korean conflict, often turned on the CBS News at the dinner table, and we would watch news of the Vietnam War. And my father continued to encourage me to pursue a military career, to join the army, to have an experience of war. And perhaps you can understand that when I was 8 and I saw Hiroshima absolutely destroyed, and when I watched the news about the Vietnam War, I was not so gung-ho about an army career and going to war. So I would say for me, that was it's kind of a long-winded explanation of my fall from innocence into knowledge of worldly conflicts and why Heaney's poems about a similar situation resonated for me. So in 1986, when I got a job at the College of William and Mary, where I'm at right now, I started writing essays about Seamus Heaney. I wrote a number of essays. I did research by going to Belfast to Queen's University, where Heaney had been a student and where he published some of his first poems in student literary journals. I found these youthful poems, and I also spent time with the relative of a friend in Belfast during the Orange Day activities. Orange Day, July 12th in Northern Ireland, is a day when a lot of Protestants come out to celebrate the union between Britain and Northern Ireland. It's also a time, at least back then, when the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, would attack Protestants. Anyhow, I was there for several days, and it seemed to me like I was in a war zone. I got a better sense of the sort of thing that had shaped Seamus Heaney's life and that Seamus Heaney often wrote about in his poems. So around, I published this first book in 1992, and fast forward a couple of decades, sorry, I'm still getting over a cold. I invited Seamus Heaney to William and Mary. This is in 2002, and he spent several days here, and he talked to me about selling his papers. I remember he said, "Oh, Henry, if you had a lot of papers and you had Harvard University and Emory University and the National Library in Ireland asking you for your papers, what would you do? Would you give the papers, donate the papers to the National Library in Ireland, or would you sell them to Harvard or Emory?" And I told him, well, I think I'd give them to the National Library in Ireland. I gave him my reasons. Well, shortly afterwards, he sold his papers to Emory. And around 2008, I wrote Seamus, and I asked them if I could have permission to look through his letters, his papers. You had to get permission to do that. And I also explained that I wanted to write a short literary biography, kind of along the lines of Richard Ellman's first biography of Yeats, Yeats, the Man in the Mask. I mentioned Ellman's book because I knew Seamus Heaney knew that book. He was one of Ellman's friends, and I was very close to Richard Ellman too. Richard Ellman had been my supervisor for a number of years when I did graduate work at Oxford. Anyhow, Seamus wrote me back a very friendly letter. Yes, you can have permission to look at my papers, and yes, go ahead with your project. Well, a while after that, a year or two after that, I had an agent trying to find a publisher for my short literary biography. And that's when things got complicated. Seamus Heaney told me that, in fact, he didn't really want a literary biography written. And he said at some point, I think he said, when I'm not around, my family will appoint an authorized biographer who will be Irish. And I realized, I'm not Irish. So I spoke to Heaney on the phone for quite a while, and I said, I understand your position now, so I will stop my work. But I had done an awful lot of research. I had gone through hundreds and hundreds of letters and papers at Emory. So after Heaney died in 2013, I decided to go back to my research. And I had a new perspective at the time. What I realized from reading through all of Heaney's poems again and almost all the essays, reviews, articles I could find that have been published reading through my research, and also listening to a lot of stories about Heaney, what I realized was that he was really obsessed with the idea of the artist's gift. I suppose in his case, the poet's gift. And he was very interested in gift exchange rituals, very interested in stories about gift exchanges. And I think he felt because he was gifted, he had received so many gifts, and he often thought about his awards, including the Nobel Prize, as a huge gift. Because he had received all these gifts, he felt an ethical obligation to share those gifts with others around the world. And as you probably know, he was a global literary celebrity. He was always being asked by people all over the world to come and share his gifts, to share his poems or give lectures. And I think he really exhausted himself doing that. If you read his letters, he's always complaining about being exhausted by all of his globetrotting. And so I mentioned this ethical obligation to give gifts. Well, I had some firsthand experience of his generosity, of his gift giving. When I invited him to William and Mary back in 2002, and when he stayed in Williamsburg and on the campus for about 3 days, he was just so generous to everyone, signing everyone's books. And as soon as he left, he was on a hectic 2-week book tour. As soon as he left, I was in my office right here where I am now, and I got a call, and it was Seamus. And I didn't know why he was calling me, but he said, Henry, thanks so much for hosting me at William and Mary, but I have a request for you. And I said, well, what is that? And he said, I'd like you to go to my hotel where I stayed because I left some Irish coins there. I would like you to get those Irish coins. And this kind of mystified me. I thought at first, maybe he wanted me to send him the Irish coins, but I knew, Irish coins are worthless in the US. I thought maybe he wanted me to mail the Irish coins back to Dublin. I just couldn't understand. And then he said, and Henry, I want you to give the Irish coins to your children. And that just kind of blew me away. My wife and I had organized a party for him and some of my English department colleagues at our house. He had met my 2 young children who were about 5 and 8 at the time, but he hardly knew my children. For some reason, he wanted to give my children a gift. I think my children thought of him as a kind of Santa Claus. And then after his busy 2-week tour, which he told me was even busier, he was not only giving readings at colleges, but he was giving some charity readings to raise money for Irish hospitals. When he was back in Dublin, he sent me a big packet of specially printed, signed poems, lectures, essays. Again, a little light went on in my head, and it seemed that, according to Heaney's perspective, I had given him some gifts, I gave him a big check for reading at William and Mary, but, I had done something for him at William and Mary. So he wanted to have an exchange of gifts. He wanted to reciprocate by giving me gifts. So that's really how I came to write this book, Seamus Heaney's Gifts. For him, too, as I realized, he thought of his poems coming to him as gifts. He often talked about how these poems would come from mysterious sources at unexpected times, unexpected moments of inspiration. It just seemed like you'd get a gift, and he'd sit down, in 5 minutes or so, he would write out the poem. Um, Anyhow, those were some of the ideas that are behind this book, Seamus Heaney's Gifts. I was asked to speak just very briefly about my current projects. I'm now working on a very different sort of project, although I guess it's similar in some ways. I'm writing a book that's mainly about an old college classmate of mine and a friend of mine, Reggie Williams, who is also preoccupied with the idea of the gift, of being gifted, and of your obligation, if you're gifted, to try to give back to the community, give back to others. Now, I say Reggie Williams is a bit different from me, different from Seamus Heaney. I got to know Reggie when I was at Dartmouth, and he was a fantastic athlete. He was drafted by the Cincinnati Bengals. He was a star for 14 years on the Cincinnati Bengals football team. He played in 2 Super Bowls. Just an extraordinary athlete. It also happens that he's very devoted to poetry. If he were sitting here, he would probably start reciting poems to you. Poetry played an instrumental part in his life. He had a terrible stroke. He had so many injuries from football, but he had a terrible stroke after some of these, after some operations for his injuries, and he couldn't speak. He was in the hospital. He said it was probably the most frustrating experience in his life. And then he remembered having to memorize a poem, a traditional poem, Invictus, when he was in college. And he started reciting the poem. And everyone around him started clapping. And Reggie later said, it was a poem that unlocked my voice. It was a poem that allowed me to speak when I couldn't speak. After Reggie's NFL career, the CEO of Disney, Michael Eisner, hired him because Reggie had this idea that materialized at Disney World. He had this idea of building what became the ESPN Wide World of Sports complex, this huge sports complex at Disney World. So Reggie actually reached out to me a couple of years ago and asked me to work on a book with him. As I say, the book will mainly focus on Reggie, but Reggie insisted that I write about how our very different lives have intersected in surprising ways over the years. And I should also say that I finished what I hope will be my next poetry book. I finished a poetry manuscript a little while ago, and I think it's being considered at LSU Press. So I think I'll stop talking now. I was asked to let you all know that to reward you for listening to me go on and on, you can get a gift in the form of a 40% discount to my book, Seamus Heaney's Gifts. But now I think we have time for some questions, and I'll do my best to answer whatever questions you have.
Thank you. Our first question is about Heaney's poems. Can you talk about recommendations, favorite poems, and why those particular pieces or even collections stand out to you the most?
Yes, well, just give me one second here. I have, I would recommend um, getting Seamus Heaney's early collections. I have all these early connections, these early collections, like Death of a Naturalist. The next one was Door into the Dark. The next one, Wintering Out, North. Uh, I would begin at the beginning. And there's another good book. It's called Opened Ground, Selected Poems 1966 to 1996. That gives you a wider range of Heaney's poems. But as I say, I would begin at the beginning. In Heaney's various selected poems, he always put his poem Digging first. And I think for him, Digging was a kind of manifesto. He was paying homage to his father, his grandfather, who actually dug potatoes for a living, or dug peat near the family farm, Mossbawn. But Heaney, in the poem, even though he's respectful to that paternal or patriarchal tradition, he's basically saying, I'm going to go in my own way. I'm going to use my pen as my spade. I'm going to use my pen to dig with. And I'll be, as a poet, as a writer, digging down into the history, the cultural past of Ireland and Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Our next question here is about the development of Heaney's work over time, differences and evolutions in his work from its beginning until the later parts of his career. How do you see those earlier collections sort of as different or as evolving, into the later collections?
Right. Well, Heaney often talked about his evolution as a poet, and he said, and I think it was very, very true about those early volumes I mentioned. In his early volumes, he was digging down into the dark past of Ireland. Sometimes he would quote James Joyce on the nightmare of history. I think when you read a lot of history, when you read the history of Ireland, it can be rather nightmarish. But there was this digging down into the dark and dismal past that preoccupied him early on in his career. Heaney often mentioned this book, Door into the Dark. He was trying to open up a kind of door into the dark. And then after North, with the book Fieldwork, he said in a number of interviews, what he was now trying to do was open a door into the light. And then later on, he said, well, I'm not so preoccupied now with, the dark, depressing realities of history. I'm more concerned with the supernatural and miracles and marvels. It was as if he was going in a different direction. He had gone down into the underworld early in his career, and now he was kind of going up to the sky, going up towards heaven. He often compared his own career to Dante's journey in the Divine Comedy. Dante at the beginning of the Divine Comedy goes down into the darkness of the Inferno, down into the underworld, but then he gradually makes his way up the mountain of purgatory and then off to paradise. So I think that's how I see his career, although I think later on he was also opening some doors into the dark. But there was definitely a change in perspective.
Thank you. Our next question here is about the process of writing this book. So you described your personal correspondence with Heaney over decades, as well as uh, really knowing him perhaps on a more individual or personal level than a typical biographer might know, for example. How do you think that this individual or personal correspondence with him influenced the way that you approach the topic? Did you find yourself struggling to maybe be critical of him, for example, because you had a personal relationship, right? How did you sort of balance the way that you approach this topic given that relationship?
Yeah, well, I I took my interactions with him and my correspondence with him that yeah, extended over about a 3 decade period. I took all of that as being very beneficial. I mentioned the first book that I wrote that was about his earlier poetry, and he invited me up to Harvard, where he had a professorship. He was the Boylston Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory at Harvard. And um, he let me ask a lot of questions about his work. And he gave very full answers to all my questions. And over a period of years, I would write him letters asking him lots of questions. And some of the letters which I have are probably 4 or 5 pages long. I was very interested in, at that point, very interested in how religion, his Catholicism, had influenced his work. I got very interested in the in the Catholic mystics, and in his letters, and I don't think he revealed this in any other interview or essay. He told me about early Catholic texts, and especially Catholic mystical texts or encyclopedic studies of Catholic mysticism. So that I found that was very, very helpful when I was trying to understand and write about his poetry. And when I went to see him at Harvard, it was around 1985. You know, he gave me gifts, so that was one of the clues that I got about his very generous nature. And I should say, you know, over the past 40 years, I've invited a lot of writers, a lot of famous writers to William and Mary to give readings, and nobody has been as generous as Heaney.
Thank you. We have a question here from Warren in the audience, and the question is a little unique in its structure. So Warren shared some lines from Station Island and asked you to comment on some of the lines from the poem. Is that okay?
Well, I can try.
Okay, so these are well-known lines, so I'm sure you'll be familiar with them. The lines from the poem and Warren saying of James Joyce's Ghost. You are fasted now, lightheaded, dangerous. Take off from here and don't be so earnest, so ready for the sackcloth and the ashes. Let go, let fly, forget. You've listened long enough, now strike your note.
Yeah. Well, I remember that dialogue with James Joyce, and I think James Joyce is encouraging Heaney not to be so caught up in pilgrimages, not to be so caught up in his Catholic background. You know, of course, Joyce or Stephen Dedalus in A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man talks about flying over the nets of religion and flying over the nets of national politics and so on. And of course, Joyce did that. You know, he left Ireland. He spent most of his time on the continent of Europe. And but I see this as a kind of evidence of a debate that was always going on in Heaney's mind. he he described himself as a lapsed Catholic. He had lapsed in his 20s, but as I say, sometimes with lapsed Catholic, you never really lapse. So he wanted to move on. I think that some of the imagery in that part of Station Island is swimming on, which struck me as being kind of ironic because Heaney always talked about his fear of water. I think he was scared to swim away from the Catholic tradition that had shaped him, shaped his mind, and shaped his writing. So yeah, my first book really focuses on the contraries that always seem to be in conflict in Heaney's mind. Uh, you know, should he be a devout Catholic or should he swim away from all that Catholic stuff that attracted him early on? And I think those contraries were in conflict, but I would maintain this was one of the uh, messages of my first book. The contraries were in conflict, but they were in creative conflict.
Thank you. Well, that is our last question, so we can go ahead and say thanks and goodbye to the audience.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you all for listening to me talk. Um, I'm sorry I can't see you. I'm sorry I can't interact with you face to face. But I hope I hope you found what I had to say enlightening about a wonderful poet.